This video is brought to you by Imprint. One of the biggest news stories in the UK at the moment is, by far, the fallout from the riots that have engulfed the country for the better part of the last month. Originally started following misinformation surrounding the murder of 3 girls in Southport at a yoga and dance workshop, the riots swiftly spiralled even further into anti-immigrant violence, with buildings set ablaze and shops being pillaged. For their part, the police have been keen to crack down hard on these rioters, with more than 1,000 arrests and more than 500 charges being made. As a result, many of those caught up in rioting have been handed multi-year sentences, something that certain right-wing commentators have criticised as being particularly harsh. Now, while much of the media have been focused specifically on the rioters themselves, much less attention has been paid to those that fanned the flames, especially online. While other countries, such as the US, have a blanket stipulation in their constitution stating that their citizens have a right to freedom of speech, the UK doesn't really have this, with the right to free speech being qualified by the right of others not to be subjected to hate speech. As such, laws exist that prevent people from being allowed to make hateful comments about other groups, something the police have invoked a lot more recently in relation to the rioting. So in this video, we're going to have a look at why the police are allowed to do this, how these powers have been used recently, and some of the arguments in favour and against these police powers. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. Now, the most pertinent piece of legislation in relation to all of this is the 2003 Communication Act, specifically Section 127, which makes it illegal to send a message by means of a public electronic communications network that is grossly offensive or is of an indecent, obscene, or menacing character. One of the first big, notable, and controversial uses of the legislation after it was introduced was back in 2010. When Paul Chambers tweeted the following: "Crap, Robin Hood Airport is closed. You've got a week and a bit to get your shit together, otherwise I'm blowing the airport sky high." While certain comedians and celebrities, such as Stephen Fry, defended Chambers, it was argued by the prosecution that his tweet met the criteria of an offensive message, stipulated in the 2003 Act. This argument was accepted. Chambers was found guilty, then fined £385 and ordered to pay £600 in court costs. However, following an appeal in which his lawyer argued that Shakespeare would have been prosecuted if he tweeted certain parts of Henry VI Part 2, his conviction was quashed. Now, the reason we bring this case up is that it highlights just how difficult enforcing laws on online communication can be. Were a similar statement made in the context of a stand-up routine from one of the more edgy comedians, it's hard to see the police taking an interest. However, when tweeted online from an unknown individual, the intent is seemingly more ambiguous. Nonetheless, in an attempt to clear up any of this ambiguity, only a couple of years after this case, in 2012, the Director of Public Prosecution, current Prime Minister Keir Starmer, issued new guidance in relation to the Communication Act, stating that if someone posts a message online that amounts to a credible threat of violence, specifically targets an individual or individuals, or breaches a court order designed to protect someone, then they should be prosecuted. This is also true of people who receive malicious messages and then pass them on, which, in essence, refers to retweeting something. The caveat imposed, though, was that a tougher test would be used by police to determine whether those accused of grossly offensive, indecent, obscene, or false communications are charged. He argued that this is because it would not be in the public interest to take such individuals to court, and that this new guidance would protect the individual from threats or targeted harassment while protecting the expression of unpopular or unfashionable opinion about serious or trivial matters, or banter or humour, even if distasteful to some and painful to those subjected to it. This guidance was then developed yet again in 2013, clarifying that prosecutions were unlikely when the author of the message had expressed genuine remorse, took swift and effective action to remove the communication, or when messages were not intended for a wider audience. It's against this backdrop that the most recent charges against those that were seen to incite riots were laid, many of whom were given custodial sentences. For example, Lee Dunn was jailed for 8 weeks after sharing 3 racially aggravated anti-migration memes on Facebook, and Billy Thompson was jailed for 12 weeks after also sharing racially aggravated content to social media. Both were charged under Section 127 of the Communications Act. For some, these sentences seem unreasonable. Will Lloyd, writing for The Times, highlights that some might question whether prosecutors and judges who deliberately keep an eye on their political bosses and the headlines are making examples of foolish people who pose little actual threat to the public. This was something that Douglas Murray argued in favour of in The Spectator, saying that it is impossible not to notice that it is indeed the plebs who have been marched to the court sharpish during the unexpected speeding up of our justice system in the wake of this month's riots. Others, though, argue that there is nothing unprecedented about the law being particularly harsher in the context of violence in the UK. Joanna Hardy-Susskind, a barrister, claims that during times of widespread disorder and mob violence, the principle of deterrence in sentencing comes to the fore. It's a legitimate aggravating factor that a person has posted criminal material online against the backdrop of dangerous, volatile times. This was exactly what happened back in 2011, the last time we saw this level of rioting across the UK. In fact, in some instances, the punishments were even harsher, with 2 individuals, Jordan Blackshaw and Perry Sutcliffe-Keenan, being handed 4 years each for using Facebook to incite a riot that actually never took place. Now, it's not up to us to determine whether the police are right to have invoked these powers, whether they were proportionate, or whether they demonstrated a slow slide towards censorship. However, it is at least true to say that there is at least some precedent for the Communications Act being used in this way, and it's clear that this guidance has been updated over time in order to try and balance concerns around freedom of speech with that of protections from hate speech. We'll leave it up to you to decide whether this balance, in this instance, has been struck. If you want to keep learning, the best way is through Imprint. That's the brand new way to learn built from the ground up. And seriously, unless you've used the app before, you likely haven't experienced something like this. That's because Imprint is beautifully illustrated and animated, creating a highly visual, effective and interactive learning experience built for bite-sized learning. You can take advantage of their expansive library of courses, book summaries, and articles to learn about psychology, philosophy, leadership, the science of happiness, productivity systems, finance, science, technology, health, and wellness, history, and more. Plus, you can learn about these things quickly, with most individual lessons taking a few minutes to complete. That speed doesn't mean it's light on information either. Imprint is built around the science of learning, so it helps to build habits around learning, utilises high-quality visuals to boost understanding, as well as letting users learn at their own pace. Ultimately, Imprint is a way to feel good about your screen time and learn something new, rather than just mindlessly scrolling on social media. Stop doom scrolling, start learning. So join the millions of users learning with Imprint by clicking the link in the description. The first 200 people to sign up will get 20% off an annual plan. Plus, they'll know you came from us.